It's a difficult idea we are discussing tonight. Um, it's hardly, you can hardly encounter any scholar of Nietzsche who will agree on the many sides, the will to power, the many interpretations it has received. And so the little slice that we reserve tonight for our discussion, I think will be somewhat colored by my own vision of this concept. Through the years, I have been teaching Nietzsche quite a few times at seminars in my teaching career. And so he has kind of grown on me up, but at the same time, one should always be ready to overcome one's own interpretation if one wants to follow Nietzsche. And in order for us to sort of remember what we are doing tonight, a few remarks about what we have already discussed. Number one, we have read what's often called Nietzsche's autobiography. That's a book he wrote in the very last moments of his life while he was still healthy. Ecce Homo contains a review of pretty much all the books that he had been written, but one formula stuck out for our purposes, and that was the subtitle of the book, How One Becomes What One Is. And so far we have been focusing on that one. Who is that one that he talks about? And in order to understand that, we had to dig into two major ideas. One was the self. You know, he is practically the self, is the one who becomes what the self is. So one thing we had to clear up is the self. The other thing we had to clear up in order to know what the self was the doctrine of eternal recurrence. So very quickly, a summary of those, we found out that according to Nietzsche writing, the self is a fiction, actually a multiple fiction. What that means is that it is an invention. It's not lying there anywhere. It's not a substance. We have to invent it, and we invent it by being creative. And for Nietzsche, that meant kind of being creative on multiple areas, because there are formulations where he says the self is a multitude, not just one interpretation in me, but multiple interpretations. And that brought up the idea, well, what if there are several interpretations? There must be some interpretations that are better than others, and he agrees. There are some interpretations that are better, and they change also. But the criterion of what makes interpretation better than other is what makes you more creative. So this kind of perspectivism, which is entailed by Nietzsche saying there are only interpretations, is that we never really know the truth. It's always veiled by our own interpretations. And so the question, what is a good interpretation for Nietzsche, is a good interpretation that makes me more creative, more hard to myself, more disciplined, more spiritualized in all my senses. And so art becomes the big area where he practices, as we shall see today, the will to power. And by art, he really means, so he was a Shakespearean very early on. In his youth, he played Shakespeare's role, but as a young scholar, he sort of adopted the Shakespearean world theater. You know, the world is a stage, and all the men and women merely players, or things like you can find in Shakespeare. We are made of the stuff dreams are made on, and they are surrounded by a sleep. I mean, that really is a kind of mask, maybe the favorite mask that Nietzsche will carry throughout his life, as we shall see. But in general, there is an enormous amount of literary characters, of authors, that he sort of figured, sizzled on, made them sort of like little exemplars of what for him was a model of a successful self-fictionalized self. This, by the way, is called often fictional realism. By that is meant that he moves the Shakespearean world theater out of the stage and makes the world as a whole the stage of theaters, where all these men and women, the kind of figures that he has, they are exemplars of an application of the will to power. So the self can be a literary character that you like a lot, or several characters. For him it was the brother Karamazov, Madame Bovary, Stendhal, or it can be an author like Goethe, Spinoza, Julius Caesar, Montaigne he liked, Stendhal he liked. It's just no end when you go into his writings, the kind of references he makes of books he has read. So to make it all short, I think the self as a fiction prepares the ground of taking an aesthetic view of Nietzsche's will to power, because for him, since there is no ultimate truth, we have to create that truth. We have to make it work for us. And this making work for us already has the notion of will to power in it, as you shall see. So the second idea that we discussed, the eternal recurrence, we agreed that it is a thought experiment. It's not a sort of cosmological idea. I mean, it is, but he didn't attribute too much importance to that. What is involved with the eternal recurrence, it's a thought experiment. And it says, it's a yes saying to everything that has happened in the past and is happening now. He had a term for that, a Latin term, amor fati, the love of fate. You cannot avoid it. And unless you really are incapable of, really adopting that view, that you affirm everything that has happened without repression, without trying to make it more beautiful, I mean, just a naked kind of interpretation of the fate that's coming towards you, you cannot begin to work on the will to power. The will to power, in other words, is a kind of collaboration with fate. And so that brings us again, so pretty much to the beginning now of the will to power. I pause just a little bit now to see whether there are questions about this sort of getting in tune again before we open how should I say, the doors to the will to power.
No question from my side.
Okay, all right.
Perhaps a small point, Eugen,
Yeah.
related to, I think you mentioned it last time round, that there is quite a close relationship between Schopenhauer and Der Wille zum Leben and, of course, Der Wille zur Macht at Nietzsche. Perhaps you could explain a bit this kind of, let's say, relationship.
Yes, what he liked about Schopenhauer as educator is as a book, is Schopenhauer's pessimism. That's what he really liked. Here he was a philosopher who was thoroughly disgusted with life, and a huge antagonist of Hegel, of course. And he was, for Nietzsche, the protagonist of a tragic philosopher. But the way he then sort of copped out of it, you know, that he wanted to subdue the will. The will in Schopenhauer is an enormous creative force. His main work, the world as will and representation. Imagine, he wrote it when he was a young man of about 20-some years and never wrote anything else for his entire life, only commented on his early thing. But the main idea there is that the will, this incredible life force for him, needed to be subdued mostly by music. He loved music a lot, or by poetry, by art, etc. You would have to somehow find the peace of mind to subdue that will. And that's where Nietzsche lost Schopenhauer. He went with Schopenhauer into the will and the willpower, because there was no free will in Schopenhauer, in that will. There is no free will. It's fate for Schopenhauer too. And so it's a life force. And so there are sort of two halves, if I may say it, for Nietzsche. One, that he actually sees somebody who he can identify with, that we have to say yes to this miserable, miserable, tragic world. And on the other hand, he wanted to stay with the vicissitudes of the will, the fate to endure. So, an affirmation on his part and a rejection. Does that answer your question?
I think we can continue.
So, okay. So now we have to define the will to power. What is it? First of all, it's not anything like a free will. Nothing to believe in free will. So what is it? It is the life affirmation in its total embrace. It is really the will to power is the preparedness to accept anything and everything that not only has passed, but comes your way now. And as you well know, thinking doesn't change anything in the past. And so there's a real task to appropriate the past. We have talked about it last time a little bit, in ways that you are inventing the past, because he thinks you can only interpret a world, and you can only relate to a world that you yourself made it. We have no capacity of getting to the truth. So our only way is really the will to power, to say yes to what's happening macroscopically and microscopically. And again, there is a cosmological version of the will to power, and there is a psychological version. Cosmologically, it just means that there are no things in the universe. There are only centers of forces that keep themselves in infinite tension. And it is that tension, it's that inequality of these forces that keep the universe going. And we, this particular Earth, this little star that he sometimes calls the Earth, there's just one little point in the vastness of the universe, and you take anything out of that where everything is connected with everything else, and you cannot, because everything influences everything else. So this cosmological view, which you might be tempted to see, something resembles a little bit the quantum physics world that we talked about it last time a little bit. Well, it's nothing like it, because the latter is a science, but for him it's just sheer speculation. And there are some authors like Deleuze in France, and in general the French Freud, it was about a decade or 15 years, then it's not the French Freud, it's the French Nietzsche. Nietzsche was sort of conceived as an anti-foundationalist, and they made Deleuze, Gilles Deleuze especially, made a point in going into the cosmological dimension a little bit, talking about forces. But Nietzsche himself was not at all interested in it. For him, again, what was important about the will to power was psychology. And without a doubt, I think, in general, I have a tendency of thinking, when I think of Nietzsche, as a psychologist, unmatched when you think of other works he has written, like The Genealogy of Morals. He had a particular eye of seeing through some of the hypocrisies and tendencies. And so what does the psychological dimension of the will to power say? It says the will to power consists in the imposition of my will to create a higher culture. Higher meaning the world of creation, art, literature, music, etc. So the will to power is really relating to an individual insofar as the individual is capable of leaving a mark on this planet of outstanding dimension, this Übermensch, this human being who has this capacity of vision. That is the appropriate scene of the will to power. So for Nietzsche, culture relied on the individual. So the primary focus for the will to power remains the self, because the self is really engaged in constant metamorphosis. So the will to power is directed to one's own self, and it consists in the following: to shape oneself into a work of art. Now, what does that mean? What would it mean to shape the self into a work of art? Nietzsche gives us an extremely beautiful example in the first book he wrote. The book's title is The Birth of Tragedy. He finished it before he even was 24 years old. I think it was about 22 years old when he finished it. Has never left it. He has competed, he has tried to improve on it all his life. And even 3 months before he collapsed in insanity, he still thought that this was this incredible idea he had about what makes tragedy, the definition of tragedy. Now imagine, the tragedy were plays that Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides wrote. There are about 33 such plays around that we still have. And they were played on one of the sides of the Acropolis when you go to Athens. And what they did was these plays drew from Greek mythology and created a sense of the cruelty, the vengeance, the incredible passions, the murders, the intrigues, everything you could even now imagine going on in life, etc., came to language and performance by the tragedies in these plays. The actors wearing a mask and speaking through those masks. They were all male actors, so the women again had male masks, but they all didn't take an inch away from the cruelty of life. And the Plato, for instance, hated these plays. Because why? They released enormous emotional forces and without really proposing a solution. It was almost like paradox after paradox. So Antigone, for instance, you remember, Antigone goes into her death, kills herself. Nobody has really found a reason why she did that. Well, we have reasons it did it for the brother, but still. Or Oedipus. Oedipus fulfills this incredible oracle of his, unknowingly, that he sort of obeys a large kind of curse, etc. Until at the end, Oedipus at Colonus, he's nobody, absolutely nobody, completely wiped out. And then the Greek tragedy then asked the chorus, well, is it at a point where I'm really nobody that I begin to be human? I mean, it's endless. You can examine these tragedies, but Nietzsche claims, and now we turn to Nietzsche, in his book, The Birth of Tragedy. He claims that he has gotten the essence of it. And the essence is the interplay of two gods. they were both sons of Zeus. One god, Apollo, was the god of light, of sculpture, of visibility, of order, of poetry, of art, everything that's sort of orderly. The Greek tried to tame the passions of life. What Nietzsche does, he adds another god to this entire ensemble, and that god is Dionysus. Now, Dionysus is a god who emerges from the mystery cult of ancient Greek. And what he does, this Dionysus, he is intoxicated most of the time. He tries to get rid of any kind of self-consciousness that he has. He indulges in dismembering of the human figure in order to destroy that form, precisely that other god Apollo always wants to do. And he said that what the Greek really did, they invented the tragic notion of life by inserting Dionysus into the picture. Dionysus, who is basically formless, he loses individual self in drunken revels, etc. He has no order, he has no respect, there is no civilization, there is, you can't call it chaos, but there are long lists. And his entire life, Nietzsche was trying to overcome and improve on that list of what the Dionysian lifestyle really was like. But the upshot of this is that those two forces had to be regarded together. The tension Nietzsche was interested in the tension, not in that they somehow would be nice, reconciliation, nice little balance. That was bourgeois for him. You know, a little bit of Apollo in your life, and then after you have worked, you go home, have a little glass of wine, a little Dionysian thing. No. For Nietzsche, these were world powers of enormous dimension that he kept on emphasizing. So the work is completed, it's published, and guess what? All the classical scholars of that age condemn it, saying, what is he talking about? Nobody has ever seen something like the Dionysian thing. I mean, we have been studying Greek culture all our lives. He must be mistaken. And for the first time when I read that, it dawned on me that here something was very typical about Nietzsche's notion of the will to power. It is an invention. It is not the meticulous study of the whatever you can find, say, in the Greek literature. The Greek philologist, could not find the vision of Nietzsche in the data that they were studying. Now that is highly revealing, because nowadays nobody talks about those scholars. Nobody even knows their names, whatever they were studying, the Greek classic. But everybody talks about Nietzsche. And that's exactly the will to power for him. To do something that leaves a mark in the universe that you have created, invented, and overcome, even, because you always need to see to it that you get other versions of it, you work on it, because there is always the becoming, which is so important. So for me, it was a sort of a nice remembrance when I said that. When I was a young, let's say younger scholar in the 60s, I used to read all the works of Martin Heidegger. And I sort of was very, very involved in that. And what I liked especially about Heidegger was his notion of truth. Now, he selected the word aletheia, and his interpretation of aletheia has two elements in it, the Greek word aletheia. First is an A, aletheia. This A is a negative, like in amoral, atypical. I mean, it was just takes it away from what follows. So you have A, and then you have Lethe. And Lethe is a river in Greek mythology of forgetfulness. And it plays a very important role in the Homeric narrative. And what it means that for Heidegger, he defined truth based on this etymology of aletheia as the unveiling, the lifting of forgetfulness, to coming into light, to something to clear, to take the veil away from having gone through the river of Lethe. You will find that river in many, even in Plato, when he talks about reincarnation, he shows how people have to go when they come back to this planet, and they have to go through that river, and it wipes out all the memories they have. So aletheia would be that revives that kind of memory that was auscultated. So I was so enthused by that. I was in Freiburg in Switzerland at that time at the university, and I thought, I'm going to take a classics course. I can't miss that. I mean, it is so wonderful. So I enrolled in a course. Guess what? The course title was The Notion of Truth in Greek Antiquity. So, at the end of 2 months, I knew 23 different meanings of aletheia, none of which was aletheia. They again said, that's a wrong mythology, nobody uses that in the Greek context. This is an invention of Martin Heidegger and so on. They sort of said no. So 23 notions after 2 months of studying the notion of truth in Greek antiquity. And it left me completely cold. And it left me, how should I say, again, I didn't know whether I should now abandon Martin Heidegger because he wasn't really a positivist in terms of positive sciences, or whether I should go with the notion of aletheia because I liked it. And it was an enormous contribution to my feeling at the time what we were all after when we were after the truth. Well, I chose the second one. But guess what again? I mean, nobody's talking about those people who found out one or other use of aletheia. They're done. But there are, I mean, you cannot find the word aletheia without mentioning Heidegger and how he invented that dimension. And so I can relate to that the difference between just studying some evidence, like you could imagine maybe in academia you study this and that, and having an idea for Nietzsche. The difference is that the idea is an invention of yours. It cannot be reduced to some documents or some data, as they would say nowadays. And that really sets him totally apart. And the other example that I have, which sort of also sheds light, and then I will stop to maybe entertain some questions before I go further, but the other thing is music. When one of these conductors prepares a symphony, they have a script, and I mean it's a score of the symphony. So they start, and guess what happens? The maestro, the conductor, starts scolding different musicians. They should do things differently. What do you mean by difference? I mean, the script is there. Well, the difference is the vision the maestro has of this piece. So it's not enough that you should have the score and then sort of now you have it, you apply the score, musicians are there. No, this is what rehearsals are for. The rehearsal makes sure that this Beethoven is my Beethoven, says the maestro. This is why they are calling the conductor maestro, which still has in the word the master of it. That musical piece has become my piece after days, even weeks of rehearsals. Finally, that last violin that still had to come on board, finally it clicks. And even in the inner conflicts a conductor may have, a discussion how that should sound, it is now the conductor's idea. And this is why people still know and go to different conductors, because their Beethoven is their Beethoven. That's a beautiful example, again, in my opinion, of the application of the will to power. I mean, again, you have objective data, you have the script, you have the musicians, they're all highly trained, etc. It's not enough. You got to have an idea of how that should sound. And if you can make that idea happening, because the musician doesn't have this idea, that the musician is part of an ensemble, he doesn't have this overlook. And even if he did have the overlook, then he would already be something of participatory in the will to power as regards that piece. So before I continue, I just want to check with you guys and Sonia and Charlotte, what if there are any questions about so far about the will to power.
There are probably too many questions, Eugen, because what you just explained is, of course, even nowadays a reality. If a musician just plays more or less unimaginatively the score that is before him, then we will not consider that as a creative interpretation of what was going on. And the longer I listened to you, I was quite reminded of another book or essay by Nietzsche in die unzeitgemäße Betrachtungen vom Nutzen und Nachteil der Historie für das Leben, because there he clearly outlines the difference between what on the one hand is the typical, as you just told us, the Gelehrtentum that just positively explains what apparently was happening in the past, and those who actually creatively and vitally interpret the history in a new way, in a more, of course, also, and that's the critical point about Nietzsche, in a heroic way.
Yes, I mean, I still struggle with a lot, as you said, with a lot of questions, thousands of questions. And one of the questions is really to pinpoint the difference between, for Nietzsche it was positivism, of course, and this notion of truth he has, that we cannot encounter truth anywhere, we have to invent it. I mean, this notion of the invention of truth, because we cannot get to it. And then we recognize, guess what? We recognize ourselves in that invention, because this is what we have created. And so I still struggle with finding out that wonderful difference between having a vision and making it stick. That is the notion of power in there, whether you can make it stick to people. And so that's just endless. I mean, I have no definite thing more to say. Even if I read Nietzsche and read it over again and again, it is so polysemous, meaning it has so many meanings, that it always comes down to what makes a creative person creative. I mean, that's really the will to power. What makes a creative person creative? That's one thing. The other thing, how does he get the recognition for what he just has created? And the third element is what he really has created is himself, because the will to power, it has to be demonstrated by your own change, etc. And then when that happens, there is an enormous joy happening. He has, as you remember, I don't know where it is, I think it's in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, all joy wants eternity. That is the eternal joy of existence that comes through your creativity, cannot be matched by anything else, he thinks. But this eternity of the joy has nothing to do with persistence or permanence. It has to do with, it's just always becoming and becoming this creativity.
It's a process.
Yeah, it's a process, but it's also a process that turns over itself as almost endlessly. The joy is the effect of seeing all things bound together. Total affirmation, the yes saying, the ultimate yes saying. And Nietzsche looked around and he couldn't see anyone that was capable of this total yes saying. So he wrote his own little story about what for him the outcome of the will to power is. It's a beautiful, I mean, he has some beautiful stories, and this story is at the beginning of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and it has the title On the Metamorphoses of the Spirit. Do you know that, Wilhelm? I mean, have you read it?
Yeah.
I mean, it's so surprising because, again, it allows a phylogenetic interpretation and an individual one. It basically means the life of the spirit had to undergo 3 transformations, metamorphoses, collectively, either as world history or as in your own individual history, etc. And the first stage is the camel. The camel has to, isn't it, the desert. All the camel can do is, I shall, I shall, I shall, I shall. He is loaded with moral theories that practically suffocate him. He has to do this and that and that and that in order to be justified. And when he actually does it, he feels guilty of not having completely done it, etc. It's the most life-negating attitude that Nietzsche can imagine. And it obviously applies to a picture of culture that is marked by the early Zoroaster and then by the Christian morality, which he basically perceived as a life-negating activity, etc. So the spirit of the camel in the desert is loaded so heavily that he can hardly go forward and stays in that desert until there is this transformation again. It's through the time factor of the camel into a lion. And the lion says, I will. The lion now takes up all these moralities that are worth nothing in Nietzsche's universe, and the lion says, I'm going to reevaluate all those values. And I want to have the value that is really life-affirming. I want to have a value that makes me live creatively. So his main word is, I will. And the magnificent sense about this, I will, is that it actually produces totally new values. And the key elements of the lion is exactly the will to power. That he realizes my values are my invention. I'm not taking over this thou shalt, thou shalt, thou shalt, thou shalt. I know that when I can be a collaborator of faith, I can collaborate with faith in order to insert myself in a process that is taken out of my hand, and yet I can infuse in that profile of mine these elements, these ideas that I have, so that finally when I look at the outcome of the will to power, I look at myself, really. So he said that for each individual who would be online to become a lion and join him in the desert in order to reevaluate all these values. And here you would think, well, that's good. That's pretty much what we are all about. I mean, we have to appropriate what we internalize from our societies and make up our own mind, and says, this I keep, this I don't, this I go, etc. But that's not enough for Nietzsche, because there's another transformation necessary. And that transformation is a transformation into a child. Now that comes as a total surprise. What does the child do what the lion cannot do? His answer is surprising. What the lion cannot do, he cannot forget. He cannot really get to a new beginning. You have to wipe out this kind of idea you have about yourself creating something, because if you are conscious of participating in the creation, I mean, that's the basic means of not being creative. It will stop you, etc. So the child is an element of getting rid of this self-reflexive consciousness. And he defines the child as innocence, as forgetfulness, new beginning, a self-rolling wheel, a first movement, a holy yes to life. Really very, very interesting how he characterizes that child. So the sense of the real is in part the ability to forget what you have created in order, guess what, to have a new beginning. So that will be a very important factor in our final answer to how one becomes what one is. But everything, for now, I just want to say that every good and evil, every happiness and suffering are included in this yes-saying of the will to power. It's really a creative overflowing into participating in the creation of the innocence of belonging. Now, the innocence of belonging, what does it mean again? It is belonging to the process of life as fate, collaborating with fate in terms of giving your own ideas to make it more powerful, and on top of it, to forget what you have just done in order to overcome your own creation. Because you're constantly becoming, but you can only be becoming when you have reached this innocence of becoming, which is typical of the child, who obviously has no self-reflective awareness, etc. So, the main ingredients of joy that we talked about are, on the one hand, the love of fate, and the other one is the will to power. And if you put both together, then you have that work of art that we were talking about. And just so that I'm signaling now a little movement into the work of art, I ask maybe questions with regard to the child especially. I mean, that's a surprising formulation as the model of the will to power.
So I have a question.
Yes, Charlotte.
I was wondering what do you think, or what did Nietzsche think? Is the will to power the will to become, so the will of becoming, motivated intrinsically or externally? Because I guess some people are in their life trying to become what they are, like going back to be a child, but some are also trying to become what, for example, society wants them to be, so it's more motivated externally. What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and my reading of Nietzsche is that it's not motivated at all, whether intrinsically nor extrinsically. The will to power has no meaning unless I create it. So if the world as a whole had a meaning, if you think of the infinity of the world, it would have found it long ago. So he draws the conclusion, there's no meaning to the universe. But within that no meaning of the universe, you now have the feeling, the life that surges in you as this incredible force of the eternal, this thought experiment, that you are ready to accept everything that comes your way, etc. And that is the joy of facing this incredible discord everywhere, the evil and the suffering and the cruelty, and even apply that cruelty to yourself, because you need to get to be able to have that inside of you, this kind of discipline and the spiritualization of all your senses in order to experience the joy of creation. But the joy of creation has no, I push it a little bit, has no meaning. Or it's the intrinsic meaning, if you want us, it's just the joy. It's joy for itself. So that I'm leaning toward that interpretation, and I have 1,000 questions about my own reading. But it was a very good question, because you think there should be a motivation to do that, to become an artist, etc. And it is true that the outcome of the will to power really is making a work of art of yourself. And the question I have when I read that was, well, what does that mean to become a work of art? Would you ever consider your life as a work of art? I mean, I sort of looked at I didn't see any kind of connection, although I love the art a lot. But then it dawned on me that what he really was saying is that the artist that works on his own or her own transformation has a kind of sensual intoxication of her entire body and mind, that all what she ever dreamed of being able to create flow together if it so happens, etc. So they instead of being an artist and contemplating artworks, you realize that you have become what you are doing, etc. So the work of art that could be described is at stake here is that the 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 art part is your own transformation into a sheer creative process, and we have to specify that. I think there is no better way, again, of specifying it as to compare it with, say, Aristotle. Now, for Aristotle, the tragedy, the play of tragedy, had that particular meaning that it allowed the Greek population to come to grips with its own emotions of cruelty, vengeance, and all of that. And since they were aesthetically enjoying it, physically they were safe. Besides the play, there was a reality outside the play. And this is why Aristotle said to experience a tragic play like Antigone or Oedipus purifies your emotion. He used the word catharsis, really. So today again, I mean, you would probably go to a football game that's very aggressive and say, well, it does pretty much the same job, etc. It sublimates some of your inner impulses and inserts it as an acceptable kind of civilizatory kind of measure. So, but that was Aristotle's belief. But Nietzsche is different. For Nietzsche, there is no such thing as that safe theater surrounded by reality. All there is theater. There is no catharsis. You have to go through all these emotions yourself. And so when you have become the work of art itself, then you are the stage of the theater. You are this means that the highest sign of the will to power is that you are hovering over all the opposites of the universe. You're really you're doing away with all these sort of false kind of things that come your way. For instance, if you say, well, there is thinking and there is instinct, no such things as Nietzsche. Thinking itself is an instinctual process. Or you might say, tempted to say, well, it's good to have a moral conscience, at least it's guiding you. No such thing in Nietzsche, because it's precisely, it makes you a hypocrite. So that is sort of the outcome of this, my interpretation, or at least the way I read him, as the effect of the power of the will to power. And I think that the will to power, we are reaching the answer to that question. It's an enormous moment in our discussion, conversation, how one becomes what one is. The will to power is the fictional principle, and it can be defined as the self is the sum of its effects on every other thing at any time. Right? This is what we already discussed in having all these examples that you are identifying with. And the principle of truth that he's applying is that truth is not discovered. You cannot discover truth because there is none. You have to invent it. The truth about the self is self-creation. And so, since we have reached now the stage of being able to answer that question, how one becomes what one is. So, we explained the one, also the self, already an invention. So, and becoming what one is, you have to ask the question, what is one? And the answer is, one is pure becoming. So that is the is character. Destroys every kind of permanence. How one becomes what one is can be translated into one becomes pure becoming. And this is how one becomes what one is. Because what one is is becoming. And so at the end of our response, we have to become, if we follow Nietzsche's command, the innocence of becoming. And there are, of course, enormous amount of implication, but I will stop here because it's a good moment to look at our interpretation of how one becomes what one is.
Well, thank you very much, Eugen. Wonderful how you explained that this is all a process and it's not something that can be defined and then for once taken for granted. On the other hand, of course, you see, we talked about Nietzsche and his relation to the previous philosophy by Schopenhauer and others, but one cannot talk about Nietzsche without also looking at what happened to his philosophy then in due course already in the German Kaiserreich with his vitalistic and elitist interpretation of Nietzsche, and particularly, of course, then also later on Heidegger, but also, let's say, particularly the Übermensch kind of notion which was taken up. How would you relate to that? Because, you see, my opinion is clear. It's not that Nietzsche can be blamed for all that was made out of him later on.
No, it's true. I mean, we all face the same risk. I think whatever we do, once we release it into the public, we have no more rights, maybe some legal rights, but that's about all. No, the way I relate to this multiplication of interpretation is that each scholar of Nietzsche tries to adopt the Nietzsche to fit his overall outlook. It then becomes his or her Nietzsche. This is my Nietzsche. Very similar to the conductor who has a score. The score would be here, the texts that we can all read. And you know, Wilhelm, as I do, you read some of these texts and it just drives you crazy because he changes from a song to an aphorism, then he changes to some very important thing that he thinks is important, but he makes himself a buffoon. And so we all have those texts. But because these texts are so multiply polysemous, it means have so many meanings, the question then becomes, I mean, what is my take on it? And it's unavoidable that if I go and look at my own reading of these texts, I see quite a few of my of some of my pet thinking in it. I also see that I don't agree, of course, with a lot of Nietzsche. For instance, personally, I have a moral code. I mean, and that's just about destroys everything Nietzsche was after. Martin Heidegger, he had this notion of being, and he saw Nietzsche as an item of the history of being that, you know, in 2 volumes. I mean, it's enormous how this is a Heideggerian version of Nietzsche. What the Nazi did with Nietzsche, obviously, I mean, it's just he has expressions in his Will to Power, these notebooks that were discovered at the beginning of the 20th century. These little notebooks, it's sort of like a diary, etc. But if you take certain sentences out of that notebook, you have a straight Nazi application right in front of you. So there is no remedy, I think, to this, except recognizing that whenever we interpret somebody's work, we take our own interpretive lenses with us. And so it becomes a little bit of, how would you call it, hermeneutic circle? It's sort of a circle.
Yes.
So,
exactly.
And that, I mean, to be aware is fascinating to me, although you can never really get to the bottom of your own ethnocentrism. It's impossible. You just have, you're cautious and respect, therefore, all these various voices. I think Nietzsche himself might have delighted himself, not only that this was the outcome of his will to power to create a work like this, but that so many people did not agree and created, therefore, the kind of tension that he loved to be creative.